The evening Garrett Novick brought his daughter to the Millbrook Infrastructure Gala, he almost didn't go at all. His babysitter had canceled at 4:30, a text, no explanation, just sorry can't make it tonight, and he'd stood in his kitchen in his dress shirt, with his tie half knotted, looking at Mira sitting at the table doing her homework like none of this was his problem to solve. She was 8. She had her mother's nose and her mother's habit of chewing the end of her pencil when she was concentrating, and every time Novak noticed it, he had to look somewhere else for a second. "You have to go," she asked, without looking up. "I can stay at Mrs. Bergeron's." Mrs. Bergeron was 72 and went to bed at 9. Novak looked at his watch. The gala started at 7. He'd be back by 10 at the earliest. "You're coming with me," he said. Mira looked up then. Her expression was somewhere between delighted and suspicious. "To the fancy thing?" "To the fancy thing." She put her pencil down. "Do I have to wear a dress?" "You have to wear something that isn't covered in marker." She looked down at her sleeve, considered this. Okay. The Millbrook Hotel ballroom was everything Novak quietly dreaded about industry events. Chandeliers that cost more than his truck, a bar cart staffed by someone who said of course after every request, and 100 people in formal wear standing in loose clusters that meant something if you knew the code, and nothing if you didn't. He knew the code. He'd been an engineer with the city's infrastructure division for 11 years. He knew which clusters were worth approaching and which ones were just people who'd once sat on the same panel and hadn't figured out they had nothing left to say to each other. He usually worked the room for an hour, spoke to whoever he needed to speak to, then went home and had a beer on his porch and thought about the structural drawings he hadn't finished. Tonight he had Mira. She walked beside him with her hands clasped behind her back, taking in the chandeliers, the white tablecloths, the towers of shrimp on ice. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "It smells like the church at Christmas." "That's money," Novak said. She made a face like she was filing that away. He got her a plate of things she'd actually eat. Crackers, a few pieces of fruit, a tiny quiche she examined with scientific seriousness before biting into, and steered her toward a table near the windows where they could watch the room without being in the middle of it. He spotted Aldrich from the Transit Authority, gave him a nod. Aldrich lifted his glass. That was enough for now. It was when he was scanning the room for his deputy director that he first noticed the woman. She was sitting alone at the far end of the same row of tables, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of guests, with a glass of sparkling water and the particular stillness of someone who has decided not to need anything from anyone in this room. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse the color of winter wheat. Her hair was dark, cut short on one side. She had the kind of posture that people described as composed when they wanted to be polite about the fact that it was actually a wall. She was also clearly a guest. No serving uniform, no earpiece, no tray. A lanyard hung from her jacket pocket with a conference badge. She had a small leather portfolio on the table beside her glass. Nobody was talking to her. Novak watched the room move around her for a minute. People drifted past. A few glanced at her. Most didn't. One man, Beaumont from Westfield Partners, someone Novak had met exactly once and remembered as the kind of person who entered rooms like he was owed something, walked right past her without breaking stride, heading for a group of suits near the bar. Mira had noticed too. "Why is that lady sitting by herself?" she said. "I don't know. Is she waiting for someone?" Novak looked again. The woman had opened her portfolio and was making a note, completely unhurried. "I don't think so," he said. Mira thought about this for a moment. Then she looked up at Novak with the expression he'd come to think of as her verdict face. "We should go sit with her. We don't know her, Peanut. We don't know anyone here." This was, he had to admit, factually accurate. He looked at the woman again. She turned a page in her portfolio. The room continued to organize itself around the absence of her. "All right," he said. "Grab your plate." They crossed the room. Novak was aware of the slight awkwardness of the approach. A man in a city division dress shirt and an 8-year-old carrying a plate of crackers, heading for a woman who hadn't invited either of them. But Mira walked like she hadn't registered that awkwardness was an option, which was something he loved about her and occasionally envied. "Hi," Mira said, stopping at the end of the table. "We were sitting over there, but it's more fun over here. Is it okay if we sit?" The woman looked up. Her eyes were gray-green and she had the brief expression of someone recalibrating. Not startled exactly, but recalibrating. Then something in her face settled. "Of course," she said. Her voice was even. "Please." Novak pulled out a chair for Mira, then sat down himself. Garrett Novak, he said, Infrastructure Division, City of Millbrook. And this is Mira, who has apparently decided the seating arrangement. The woman's expression did something quiet that wasn't quite a smile but was close. Rosalind Thorne, she said. I'm just here for the conference. What brings you to Millbrook, he asked. Some consulting work. A slight pause. You? I was involved in the East Corridor Bridge redesign. They invited me to the dinner. He glanced around. I usually skip these. Mira's babysitter canceled. Mira had situated herself with her plate and was examining the chandeliers again. They look like upside-down trees made of ice, she said to no one in particular. Rosalind Thorne looked up at the chandeliers. That's exactly what they look like, she said. She sounded like she meant it. The dinner was served in courses, and the conversation found its rhythm the way conversations occasionally did, almost without effort, without the usual sequence of professional hedges and polite approximations. Novak wasn't sure how it happened. Thorne asked questions that weren't small talk. She asked about the East Corridor Bridge in a way that suggested she understood load distribution and material fatigue, which wasn't common at infrastructure charity galas. He asked what kind of consulting she did, and she said built environment, accessibility, structural, some urban planning, and that she'd been working out of Montreal for the past 7 years. Montreal, Mira said, resurfacing from her quiche. We went there. Daddy, we went there, we did. It was cold, it was February. It was very cold. Thorne looked at Mira. What did you like about it? Mira considered. The underground part. You can go everywhere underground and not get cold. Reso, Thorne said. The underground city, yes. Mira pointed her fork at Thorne with a seriousness that Novak had given up correcting in social situations. That is smart. Thorne looked at her for a moment. It is, she said. There was something in her expression that Novak couldn't quite read, thoughtful maybe. Or something that had been quiet for a long time and had just been handed a small reason to move. The dinner continued. Novak noticed that a few people had been aware of them, of him and Myra settling at Thorne's table, but had not come over. He noticed that when Beaumont from Westfield glanced their way, his gaze passed over Thorne entirely and landed on Novak for a fraction of a second before moving on. He filed this away. After the main course, Mira excused herself to find the washroom, and Novak stood and said he'd walk her. When he came back, Thorne was looking out the window at the city lights with an expression that was unguarded in a way it hadn't been before. He sat down quietly and didn't say anything for a moment. You didn't have to sit with me, she said, without turning from the window, not accusatory. Almost careful, like she was noting something factual. I know, Novak said. Mira's a better judge of the room than I am. A pause. How long has it been you two? He'd been asked this before, and it always depended on the person asking whether it felt like a reasonable question or an intrusion. From Thorne it felt like a reasonable question. 3 years, he said. Her mom passed. Thorne turned from the window. She didn't say the things people usually said. She just looked at him with those gray-green eyes and nodded, once, like she understood that there wasn't a correct response and had decided not to manufacture one. Novak appreciated that more than he could have explained. You're here alone, he said. I'm often here alone, she said, at these things. She said it without self-pity, the way you said something that was just descriptively true. That seems wrong, he said. She glanced at him. Something almost amused. It's efficient, he laughed, genuinely. She looked mildly surprised, and then the thing that almost became a smile earlier became one, briefly, and it changed her whole face. Mira came back then and climbed into her chair and announced that the washroom had a basket of individually wrapped mints and she had taken 2. Novak told her to put one back. She negotiated for keeping both if she let him have one. He accepted the terms. Thorne watched this exchange with an expression he couldn't name and wouldn't try to. The program began after the dessert course. Remarks from the foundation chair, a brief video about the year's infrastructure initiatives, then a keynote. Novak had half listened to these at other galas. He was mostly making sure Mira wasn't falling asleep on her arm. The foundation chair, a man named Gould who wore his wealth like a well-fitted jacket, took the podium. He thanked the sponsors, thanked the city division leads, thanked the consulting partners who'd contributed their expertise to this year's initiative. Then he said, and I want to give particular thanks to the lead structural consultant on the Millbrook Accessibility Redesign Project, whose work over the past 18 months has genuinely changed what this city's public buildings can do. Please join me in welcoming Rosalind Thorne. principal of Thorne's structural group. The room Novak turned. Thorne was already standing, smoothing the front of her blazer, and she moved to the podium with the same unhurried composure she'd had all evening. When she stepped under the lights, Novak saw the room register her properly for the first time, the way attention reorganized itself, the way people sat forward. He looked at Mira. Mira's eyes were wide. "Daddy," she whispered. "Is that her?" "Yeah," he said. "That's her." Thorne spoke for 11 minutes. She didn't use notes. She talked about the East Wing redesign at the Civic Center, the ramp system at Millbrook Transit Hub, the reconfigured plaza outside the library that the city had been promising since 2014. She talked about them not as projects but as choices, choices about who a city decided to include and who it kept waiting at the door. "Every building," she said, "tells you who it was built for. The question isn't whether to change that. The question is how long you're willing to make people wait while you decide it matters." She paused. The room was quiet. "The Millbrook Accessibility Initiative mattered," she said. "I'm grateful to have been part of deciding it did." She stepped back from the podium. The applause was genuine this time, not the polished, reflexive kind, but the kind that has a moment of delay in it, the kind that comes from people needing a second to catch up with what they'd just heard. Novak watched Beaumont from Westfield clap with what looked like concentration, the expression of a man recalibrating. Thorne came back to the table. She sat down and took a sip of her water as though she'd stepped away to check her coat rather than addressed a room of 100 people and rearranged their understanding of the past 18 months. Mira was staring at her. "You built stuff?" she said. "I designed it," Thorne said. "Other people built it. The ramp at the library?" Thorne looked at her. "You've been to that library?" "We go every Saturday," Novak said. "That ramp was. It was in rough shape before. My deputy director mentioned the redesign project, but I didn't connect it to." He stopped, shook his head. "I should have connected it to you." "You didn't have a reason to," she said, simply. He thought about that. He thought about the evening, the room moving around her, Beaumont not breaking stride, the table where she'd sat alone with her portfolio and her composure making notes. All the reasons she might have had to be somewhere else, doing something less thankless. "For what it's worth," he said, "the library ramp is used every single Saturday." She looked at him. There it was again, that movement in her face, something that had been held still deciding to move. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why." Myra had been listening to all of this with the focused attention she gave to things she couldn't quite categorize yet. Then she said, "Did you build it so kids could get in too?" Thorne turned to her. "I built it so everyone could get in," she said. "But yes, kids too." Myra nodded, satisfied, and reached for her mint. The gala wound down the way these evenings did, the band starting up, the bar getting busier, the conversations loosening at the edges. A number of people came to the table to speak to Thorne. Novak watched this with a kind of low-grade amusement, the same people who drifted past her 2 hours ago now finding reasons to introduce themselves, to mention a project they were working on, to hand her a card with 2 hands like it was an offering. She was gracious, she was efficient. She was, Novak noticed, watching the door with the patience of someone counting down. He gathered Mira's things. Mira had reached her limit and was leaning against his arm with her eyes at half-mast trying to look alert. "We're going to head out," he said to Thorne. She turned from the conversation she'd been politely concluding and looked at them both for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting down." "Mira's call," he said. "I know." She looked at Mira, who managed to produce a sleepy wave, then back at Novak. Something in her expression was direct in a way it hadn't been all evening. Unhurried, decided. "The firm's here through Friday. If you wanted to get coffee sometime this week, not a meeting, just coffee, I'd like that." Novak looked at her. In 11 years of infrastructure galas, he had never been asked to get coffee by anyone who meant anything other than a meeting. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that, too." Outside, the autumn air was cold enough to see their breath. Mira was fully awake now, revived by the cold bouncing slightly in her good shoes. "She built the ramp," she said. "She did, and nobody talked to her, for a while." Mira thought about this. "That's dumb." "Yeah," Novak said. "We talked to her, we did." She took his hand as they crossed the parking lot. The streetlights were doing something orange and soft to the trees. She was quiet for most of it, which meant she was thinking, which meant she'd come back to it. She did at the car door. "Daddy," she said. "Was it good to sit with her?" He looked down at her, the pencil-chewing kid who'd decided over a plate of crackers that a woman sitting alone in a room full of people was a reason to move. who'd asked about the library ramp and the underground city and whether buildings were built for kids. "Yeah, Peanut," he said. "It was good." She climbed in. He closed the door behind her and stood for a moment in the parking lot, the October cold on the back of his neck, thinking about a table near the windows, a woman with a portfolio and a glass of water, and the particular quality of a room that only notices what it's already decided to see. He got in the car. On the drive home, Mira fell asleep before they hit the highway, her head tipped against the window, one hand still loosely holding the mint she'd negotiated for. Novak drove through the Millbrook streets, past the Civic Center's reconfigured East Wing, past the transit hub, past the library with its new ramp lit from below, the way the city had decided to light the things it had finally decided to care for, and he thought about a woman at a podium, saying that's why it was the simplest answer in the world. And maybe it was.